11:45 in the morning on December 9th, 1945. General George Smith Patton, Jr. sat in the back seat of his 1938 Cadillac Model 75 staff car, traveling along Mannheimer Strasse near the German city of Mannheim, discussing the upcoming pheasant hunt with his Chief of Staff, Major General Horace Gay, while their driver, Private First Class Horace Woodring, navigated the quiet Sunday morning traffic. 6 months had passed since Germany's surrender ended the war in Europe, and Patton, who had commanded the legendary Third Army through its spectacular campaign across France and into the heart of Germany, now held the administrative position of commanding the 15th Army, essentially a paper organization tasked with writing official histories of the European campaign, rather than conducting actual military operations. Patton was 60 years old, but remained physically vigorous and mentally sharp, despite 3 grueling years of combat command that had taken him from North Africa through Sicily and across Western Europe in what many historians consider the most successful offensive campaign in American military history. This hunting trip to a preserve near Speyer represented a brief escape from the frustrations and controversies that had dominated Patton's final months in occupied Germany, where his outspoken criticisms of Soviet policies and his controversial statements about former Nazis had created political problems that eventually cost him command of the Third Army just 3 months earlier in October 1945. At precisely 11:45 a.m., according to the official Army accident report filed immediately after the incident, a 2.5-ton GMC Army truck driven by Technical Sergeant Robert Thompson pulled out from a side intersection called Kiefertalstrasse and began turning left across the roadway directly into the path of Patton's approaching Cadillac. Private Woodring, who was driving at approximately 20 miles per hour, according to his sworn testimony, had only seconds to react, and he applied the brakes hard while attempting to swerve right to avoid the collision. But there was insufficient time and distance to prevent impact. The Cadillac struck the left rear side of the truck at an angle with enough force to damage the front end of the staff car, but not enough to cause what anyone would normally consider a serious accident. And the impact speed was estimated by investigating officers at approximately 15 to 20 miles per hour, based on the relatively minor damage to both vehicles. The truck driver, Sergeant Thompson, was completely uninjured and remained in his vehicle, while Major General Gay, who had been sitting in the front passenger seat beside the driver, was also unhurt except for minor cuts on his nose from where his face had struck the rearview mirror during the sudden stop. But General Patton, who had been sitting in the back seat on the right side directly behind Private Woodring, suffered catastrophic injuries that seemed wildly disproportionate to the relatively minor nature of the collision. Patton later told doctors that at the moment of impact, he had been leaning forward slightly to point out something to General Gay through the windshield, and the sudden deceleration had caused his head and upper body to lurch forward with tremendous force. The back of the front seat, which in 1938 Cadillacs was reinforced with a steel frame, caught Patton directly across the top of his head and base of his skull, and witnesses reported hearing a distinct crack at the moment of impact that Patton himself later described as feeling like his neck had broken. Patton immediately told the other passengers that he could not move his arms or legs, and requested they not try to move him, demonstrating the kind of presence of mind and medical knowledge that had served him throughout his military career. General Gay quickly assessed the situation and recognized the severity of Patton's condition, and he immediately ordered Private Woodring to drive carefully to the nearest military medical facility, which was the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, approximately 15 kilometers away. The decision to transport Patton by car rather than waiting for an ambulance was made because Gay believed the general's condition required immediate professional medical attention, and the hospital could be reached faster by driving there directly than by waiting for emergency services to arrive at the accident scene. The drive to Heidelberg took approximately 25 minutes, with Patton lying carefully positioned in the back seat and remaining fully conscious throughout the journey, despite experiencing what he described as excruciating pain radiating from his neck down through his entire body. Patton talked continuously during the drive, partly from shock and partly from his natural tendency toward conversation, and he made several statements that witnesses later found haunting, given what would happen over the following days. He told General Gay that this was an absolutely absurd way for a combat general to die, and that he had always expected to be killed by enemy fire rather than injured in a peacetime traffic accident. and he expressed frustration that after surviving 3 years of combat across multiple theaters, he would be done in by something as mundane as a fender bender on a German country road. Upon arrival at the 130th Station Hospital, medical personnel immediately recognized the gravity of Patton's injuries and began emergency treatment while summoning the hospital's senior neurosurgeon, Colonel Roy Glenn Sperling, who happened to be one of the Army's leading experts on spinal cord injuries. Initial X-rays revealed that Patton had suffered a compression fracture of the third cervical vertebra, along with a displaced fracture of the fourth and fifth cervical vertebrae, injuries that had severed or severely damaged his spinal cord at approximately the C3-C4 level, resulting in complete paralysis from the neck down, with no sensation or voluntary movement in his arms, trunk, or legs. Colonel Sperling's examination confirmed the devastating nature of the injuries, and he immediately recognized that given the medical technology available in 1945, there was virtually no chance of Patton ever regaining function below his neck, though Sperling maintained hope that if the general could survive the immediate crisis period without developing fatal complications, he might eventually regain some limited arm movement. Sperling ordered Patton placed in skeletal traction using steel tongs inserted into his skull to immobilize his neck and prevent any movement that might cause additional spinal cord damage. And he began the careful process of managing a high cervical spinal cord injury in an era before modern intensive care medicine had developed many of the life support technologies that would later make such injuries more survivable. Patton's wife Beatrice was in the United States when the accident occurred, but she was immediately notified by telegram, and she departed for Germany as quickly as military transport could be arranged. Arriving at her husband's bedside in Heidelberg on December 11th, just 2 days after the accident, Beatrice found her husband paralyzed but fully alert and mentally sharp, and Patton greeted her with characteristic humor by saying that this was a hell of a way to start what he had hoped would be a relaxing hunting trip. The reunion between George and Beatrice Patton was emotionally wrenching for both of them because they both understood the severity of his injuries and recognized that his survival was uncertain at best. The medical team treating Patton faced enormous challenges because high cervical spinal cord injuries create cascading problems throughout the body's systems that can prove fatal even when the initial injury itself is survived. Patton's paralysis meant that he could not breathe effectively because the muscles controlling respiration below the neck were non-functional, and he required constant monitoring to ensure adequate oxygen levels and to suction secretions from his airways to prevent pneumonia. His inability to move also meant that he was at constant risk of developing pressure sores, blood clots, and urinary tract infections, all of which could become life-threatening in a patient with such severe injuries. Despite these daunting challenges, Patton's condition actually stabilized and even improved slightly during the first week after the accident, and by December 15th, Colonel Sperling was cautiously optimistic that the general might survive the immediate crisis period and possibly even regain some limited upper body function over time. Patton's mental state remained remarkably positive given his circumstances, and he joked with nurses and doctors while dictating letters to his wife and discussing plans for what he would do when he recovered, though everyone involved understood that his definition of recovery would necessarily be limited to survival rather than any return to normal function. On December 17th, Patton developed a high fever and began experiencing difficulty breathing that was worse than the baseline respiratory compromise caused by his paralysis, and examination revealed that he had developed pneumonia in both lungs, despite the medical team's best efforts to prevent this common and often fatal complication of spinal cord injuries. The pneumonia was treated aggressively with the best antibiotics available in 1945, including penicillin, which was still relatively new and not yet widely available for civilian use. But Patton's compromised respiratory function made it extremely difficult for him to clear the infection from his lungs. Over the following days, Patton's condition deteriorated steadily as the pneumonia worsened, and his body's systems began failing under the combined stress of the spinal injury and the infection. On December 20th, Patton developed what doctors recognized as signs of pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had formed in his paralyzed legs and broken free to lodge in his lungs, creating a life-threatening blockage of blood flow. Colonel Sperling recognized that this complication was likely to be fatal, and he informed Beatrice Patton that her husband probably had only hours to live, and Beatrice was brought to George's bedside to say goodbye. General George S. Patton, Jr. died at 5:50 p.m. on December 21, 1945, 12 days after the traffic accident that had left him paralyzed and ultimately led to the cascade of medical complications that killed him. His death certificate listed the immediate cause as pulmonary embolism and acute heart failure, with contributing factors of pneumonia and cervical spinal cord injury. A clinical description that captured the medical reality of what had happened, but could not convey the profound sense of tragic irony that many felt about America's most aggressive and successful combat commander, dying not from enemy action, but from a peacetime traffic accident. Beatrice Patton made the decision to have her husband buried in the American military cemetery at Ham in Luxembourg, rather than transporting his body back to the United States for burial. And she explained this choice by saying that George had told her many times that if he died in Europe, he wanted to be buried alongside the men of the Third Army who had fallen under his command. The funeral was held on December 24th, Christmas Eve, with full military honors and an honor guard drawn from troops of the Third Army that Patton had led to victory across Europe. The official Army investigation into the accident conducted immediately after it occurred concluded that the collision had been caused by Sergeant Thompson's failure to yield right-of-way when turning left across traffic, though the investigating officers noted that Thompson had been attempting to follow unclear hand signals from another soldier who was directing traffic at the intersection. The report documented that visibility was good, road conditions were dry, neither driver was speeding or impaired, and the accident resulted from simple human error rather than mechanical failure or deliberate action. The relatively minor nature of the collision made Patton's catastrophic injuries seem almost impossible, and the investigation noted this disparity, but attributed it to the unfortunate positioning of Patton's head at the moment of impact and the particular vulnerabilities created by the vehicle's interior design. No criminal charges were filed against Sergeant Thompson, and he was not disciplined beyond being found at fault in a routine traffic accident. And he returned to normal duty shortly after giving his statement to investigating officers. The truck driver gave consistent testimony in multiple interviews, stating that he had begun his left turn, believing he had sufficient time and space to complete the maneuver safely before the Cadillac reached the intersection, and that he had no reason to target or deliberately strike Patton's vehicle. The questions and controversies surrounding Patton's death did not emerge immediately, but developed gradually over the following decades as people began to examine the circumstances more critically and to consider whether the official explanation adequately accounted for all the unusual aspects of the incident. The fact that Patton had been making increasingly controversial public statements about Soviet policies and about American occupation policies in Germany led some observers to wonder whether his death might have been something other than a simple accident. Though no evidence has ever emerged to support these speculations beyond circumstantial observations about timing and opportunity. Several specific aspects of the accident and its aftermath have fueled continuing questions and debate among historians and conspiracy theorists. First, the disproportionate nature of the injuries suffered by different passengers in the same vehicle struck many as highly unusual, with Patton suffering fatal injuries while General Gay and Private Woodring in the same car were essentially unhurt. Medical experts have explained this disparity by noting that Patton was the only passenger not braced or holding on to something at the moment of impact, and that his forward position in the back seat placed him directly in line with the steel-reinforced seat back. But skeptics argue that this still seems unlikely to produce such dramatically different outcomes. Second, the fact that Sergeant Thompson, the truck driver, was never subjected to extensive questioning beyond routine accident investigation procedures and essentially disappeared from the historical record after giving his initial statement has struck some researchers as suspicious. Various attempts to locate Thompson in subsequent years to interview him about the accident have been unsuccessful, though this could simply reflect normal post-war demobilization and the difficulty of tracking individuals without modern databases rather than indicating anything sinister. Third, some observers have noted that Patton's medical records from his treatment at Heidelberg were initially classified and remained unavailable to researchers for many years after standard declassification schedules should have made them public, suggesting to conspiracy theorists that the records might contain information that contradicted official accounts. When the records were finally released, they showed exactly what had been reported at the time, with detailed documentation of Patton's injuries and treatment. but skeptics argue that any truly incriminating information would have been removed before release. Fourth, the decision to bury Patton in Europe rather than returning his body to the United States struck some people as unusual given his prominence and the normal practice of repatriating remains of senior officers. Though Beatrice Patton's explanation that this honored her husband's expressed wishes seems entirely plausible and consistent with Patton's well-documented identification with the soldiers under his command. The most dramatic and controversial claims about Patton's death came decades later in 2008, when a man named Douglas Bazata, who claimed to have been an OSS operative during World War II, allegedly made a deathbed confession stating that he had been ordered to assassinate Patton and had done so by firing a low-velocity projectile into the general's neck during the car ride to create an injury that would appear consistent with the traffic accident. Bazata's claims received significant media attention and formed the basis for several books arguing that Patton was murdered rather than accidentally killed. However, Bazata's confession has been thoroughly investigated by multiple historians and intelligence researchers, and the consensus among serious scholars is that his claims are not credible for numerous reasons. First, Bazata made inconsistent statements about the supposed assassination over many years, with details changing significantly between different tellings, suggesting either fabrication or confusion rather than accurate memory. Second, the medical evidence from Patton's treatment and autopsy shows injuries entirely consistent with the traffic accident and shows no evidence of any projectile wound or foreign object that would indicate Bazata's claimed method of assassination. Third, Bazata provided no documentary evidence or corroborating witnesses to support his claims, despite asserting that the assassination was ordered by senior American officials, and attempts to verify his story through OSS records and interviews with other intelligence operatives from that era have found no support for any plot against Patton. Fourth, Bazata had a documented history of making grandiose and unverifiable claims about his wartime activities that other OSS veterans disputed, suggesting a pattern of self-aggrandizement rather than reliable testimony. The historical consensus among serious scholars who have examined the evidence is that Patton's death resulted from exactly what it appeared to be at the time: a tragic traffic accident that produced unexpectedly severe injuries due to the particular circumstances of impact, combined with the vulnerabilities of 1930s automotive safety design. The fact that this mundane explanation seems almost insulting to the memory of such a towering military figure has undoubtedly contributed to the persistence of alternative theories, because there is something deeply unsatisfying about the idea that General Patton, who survived so many close calls with death in combat, would be killed by a routine fender bender. The tragedy of Patton's death extends beyond the simple fact of his loss to include the timing and circumstances that prevented him from enjoying even a brief retirement after his remarkable military career. Patton had survived 3 years of combat across multiple theaters, including North Africa, Sicily, and northwestern Europe, where he had repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire and survived numerous close calls that could easily have killed him. He had led the Third Army on one of history's most spectacular offensive campaigns, covering over 600 miles in less than 1 year, and liberating thousands of towns and cities while inflicting devastating losses on German forces. That such a warrior should die from a traffic accident just 6 months after victory seemed to many observers like a cosmic injustice or cruel joke, and this sense of tragedy was compounded by the fact that Patton's final months had been marked by controversy and frustration rather than triumph. His outspoken criticisms of Soviet policies and his controversial statements comparing former Nazi party members to American political party members had made him a political liability, and his relief from command of the Third Army in October 1945 represented a humiliating demotion for a general who had expected to end his career in glory. Patton himself had expressed premonitions in the months before his death that he would not survive long into peacetime, telling friends and family members that he felt like a relic of a different era who no longer fit into the post-war world. In one particularly haunting conversation with his wife in September 1945, Patton reportedly said that he had expected to be killed in combat and that dying in peacetime would be an anticlimax that he could barely contemplate. Whether these statements represented genuine intuition or simply the kind of melodramatic pessimism that Patton occasionally indulged in remains unknown. The military and political establishment's response to Patton's death was appropriately solemn, with official statements of mourning from President Truman, General Eisenhower, and other senior leaders, though some observers noted that the eulogies were remarkably restrained given Patton's achievements and seemed to reflect the political tensions that had marked his final months. Eisenhower's public statement praised Patton's military genius and battlefield leadership, while carefully avoiding any mention of the controversies that had led to his relief from command, maintaining the diplomatic ambiguity that characterized Eisenhower's handling of Patton throughout their complicated professional relationship. The American public's reaction to news of Patton's death was genuinely grief-stricken, with newspaper headlines across the country treating it as a major national tragedy, and many editorials noted the cruel irony of Patton surviving the war only to die in a peacetime accident. Public memory of Patton in December 1945 was still dominated by his role as the aggressive combat commander who had led American forces to victory, and the controversies of his final months had not yet significantly tarnished his popular reputation in ways that would later complicate his historical legacy. The 80 years since Patton's death have seen his reputation undergo significant evolution, with serious historians conducting more nuanced assessments that acknowledge both his genuine military genius and his significant character flaws and political failings. The tendency toward hero worship that characterized early Patton biographies has given way to more balanced accounts that examine his racism, his occasional cruelty towards subordinates, his political naivety, and his inability to adapt to the requirements of peacetime leadership, alongside his undeniable talents as a combat commander. The circumstances of Patton's death continue to generate interest and speculation 8 decades later, partly because they seem so incongruous with the larger-than-life figure he had been, and partly because the various conspiracy theories provide satisfying narratives that seem more fitting than simple accident. The human mind tends to resist accepting that major historical figures can die from trivial causes, and the urge to find deeper meaning or hidden conspiracy in Patton's death reflects this psychological tendency rather than any actual evidence of foul play. What remains undeniable, regardless of one's interpretation of the specific circumstances, is that Patton's death robbed America of one of its most successful battlefield commanders at a moment when his knowledge and experience might have proven valuable in shaping post-war military policy. Whether Patton would have adapted successfully to peacetime leadership or would have continued making controversial statements that damaged his reputation remains an unanswerable question. But his death at age 60 ensured that he would be remembered primarily for his military achievements rather than for whatever his post-war career might have been. The memorial at Ham American Cemetery, where Patton is buried, remains a site of pilgrimage for military history enthusiasts and veterans who wish to pay respects to one of America's most famous generals, and the simple white cross that marks his grave stands among thousands of identical markers for the enlisted men of the Third Army who died under his command. This burial location represents the fulfillment of Patton's stated wish to remain with his soldiers in death, as he had led them in life, and it provides a more fitting memorial than any elaborate monument could offer to a general who defined himself entirely through his relationship with the men he commanded. To understand why Patton's death generated such intense scrutiny and conspiracy, theories requires examining the controversial final months of his life, when his outspoken statements created political problems that many believed made him a liability to American policymakers. Patton had never been politically sophisticated or diplomatically tactful, and qualities that served him well as an aggressive battlefield commander became severe liabilities in the complex political environment of occupied Germany, where American officials were attempting to implement denazification policies, while simultaneously beginning to view the Soviet Union as a potential future adversary rather than a wartime ally. The problems began almost immediately after Germany's surrender in May 1945, when Patton was appointed military governor of Bavaria, a position that gave him authority over implementing American occupation policies, including the denazification program that required removing former Nazi party members from positions of authority in German government and society. Patton found these policies both impractical and counterproductive, believing that Germany needed experienced administrators to prevent chaos regardless of their past political affiliations, and he made no secret of his opinion that the denazification program was misguided and harmful. In a press conference on May 8, just one day after Germany's surrender, Patton told reporters that most ordinary Nazi Party members had joined for practical reasons rather than ideological commitment, and that treating them as war criminals would make it impossible to rebuild functional German government and society. He compared Nazi Party membership to belonging to American political parties like the Democrats or Republicans, suggesting it was simply a bureaucratic requirement for employment rather than evidence of moral culpability, and this comparison caused immediate outrage in the United States, where public opinion strongly supported harsh measures against anyone associated with the Nazi regime. Patton's even more controversial statements concerned the Soviet Union and what he perceived as the emerging threat of Soviet expansion across Eastern Europe. During a dinner with Secretary of War Robert Patterson in May 1945, Patton reportedly argued that the United States had defeated the wrong enemy and should have allowed Germany to continue fighting the Soviet Union while American and British forces remained neutral or even assisted German forces against the Soviets. Patton believed that Soviet communism represented a greater long-term threat to Western civilization than German fascism had, and he advocated for what he called preventive war against the USSR before Soviet forces could consolidate their control over Eastern Europe. These views, while privately shared by some American military and political leaders, were absolutely unacceptable for public expression at a time when the Soviet Union remained officially an American ally, and when the war against Japan still continued requiring Soviet cooperation. Patton's inability or unwillingness to keep his opinions private created enormous political problems for Eisenhower and other senior commanders who had to manage both military operations and complex diplomatic relationships with Soviet counterparts, and Eisenhower repeatedly warned Patton to exercise more discretion in his public statements. The situation came to a head in September 1945, when Patton gave another press conference where he reiterated his views on denazification and made additional inflammatory statements about the relative merits of former Nazis versus Soviet officials. When reporters pressed him on why he was retaining former Nazi Party members in administrative positions, Patton responded that the Nazi question was really no different than a question of whether someone had been a Republican or Democrat in America, and that competence mattered more than past political affiliations when rebuilding German society. These statements created a firestorm of criticism in American newspapers and among veterans organizations who viewed any perceived softness toward former Nazis as an insult to the soldiers who had fought and died defeating the Third Reich. Eisenhower, who had protected Patton through numerous earlier controversies, including the notorious slapping incidents in Sicily, finally decided that the political costs of keeping Patton in his current position outweighed his military value in peacetime. And on October 7, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army and reassigned him to command of the 15th Army. The 15th Army existed primarily on paper as an organization tasked with writing official histories of the European campaign, and the assignment represented an obvious demotion that everyone recognized as punishment for Patton's political indiscretions. Patton was devastated by losing command of the Third Army, which he had led to glory across Europe, and he made no secret of his bitterness about what he considered unjust treatment for speaking uncomfortable truths that others were too politically cowardly to acknowledge. During his final 2 months commanding the 15th Army, Patton divided his time between the mundane administrative tasks of his new position and recreational activities like hunting that provided brief escape from his professional frustrations. He wrote long letters to his wife Beatrice expressing his disgust with peacetime military politics and his sense that he no longer belonged in the post-war world. And he spoke frequently about his desire to retire from the army and return to civilian life in the United States, where he hoped to write his memoirs and perhaps enter politics, where his lack of diplomatic tact might be less of a liability. The hunting trip on December 9th had been planned as one of these recreational escapes, and Patton had been looking forward to spending a relaxing Sunday in the countryside, shooting pheasant with General Gay, who had served as his chief of staff throughout the war and remained one of his closest friends. The tragic irony that this simple pleasure outing would result in his death was not lost on anyone who knew Patton's history of surviving far more dangerous situations in combat, and the randomness of the accident seemed to mock the idea that Patton had been protected by fate during his military career. The medical care Patton received after the accident represented the best that 1945 military medicine could provide, but was limited by the primitive state of spinal cord injury treatment at that time. Modern neurosurgery had made significant advances during World War II as military surgeons gained extensive experience treating battlefield head and spine injuries, but the ability to actually repair damaged spinal cord tissue did not exist and would not develop until many decades later, with advances in microsurgery and understanding of nerve regeneration. Colonel Sperling, who treated Patton, was genuinely one of the world's leading experts on spinal injuries, and he applied all available knowledge and techniques to manage Patton's care. But the fundamental problem was that medicine in 1945 could do nothing to restore function to a severed spinal cord. The traction apparatus used to immobilize Patton's neck prevented further damage but could not reverse the initial injury, and the various complications that developed over the 12 days between the accident and Patton's death were all predictable consequences of high cervical spinal cord injury that medical science at that time could do little to prevent. The pneumonia that developed on December 17th resulted from Patton's inability to breathe deeply or cough effectively due to his paralyzed chest muscles, and while antibiotics could fight the bacterial infection, they could not overcome the fundamental respiratory compromise caused by the spinal injury. The pulmonary embolism that ultimately killed Patton on December 21st was an almost inevitable consequence of prolonged immobilization in a paralyzed patient, because blood pooling in paralyzed legs naturally forms clots that can break free and lodge in the lungs, creating the fatal blockage that no treatment available in 1945 could prevent or reverse. Modern medicine, with its intensive care units, mechanical ventilators, anticoagulant medications, and advanced surgical techniques, might have given Patton a chance at survival and possibly even some recovery of function. But in December 1945, his injuries were essentially unsurvivable, regardless of the quality of medical care provided. The medical team's inability to save Patton was not a failure of their skill or dedication, but simply a reflection of the limitations of mid-20th century medicine when confronting catastrophic spinal cord trauma. The funeral arrangements made by Beatrice Patton reflected both her desire to honor her husband's wishes and the practical realities of transporting remains across the Atlantic in winter of 1945, when shipping and air transport were still devoted primarily to repatriating living servicemen rather than deceased ones. The decision to bury Patton at Ham in Luxembourg rather than at Arlington National Cemetery or at the Patton family plot in California meant that his grave would be surrounded by those of enlisted soldiers from the Third Army, rather than by other high-ranking officers, and this democratic burial arrangement seemed fitting for a general who had always emphasized his identification with common soldiers. The funeral on Christmas Eve added another layer of poignancy to an already tragic situation, because December 24th had special significance for Patton, who had participated in the famous relief of Bastogne exactly 1 year earlier on December 26, 1944. The timing meant that Patton's funeral occurred during the first anniversary period of what many considered his finest military achievement, and the coincidence was noted by many of the thousands of Third Army veterans who mourned his loss. The investigation into the accident conducted by Army authorities immediately after it occurred was thorough within the normal parameters of traffic accident investigation, but was not designed to detect deliberate foul play because there was no reason at the time to suspect anything beyond simple misfortune. The investigating officers documented the positions of vehicles, interviewed all available witnesses, including both drivers and several bystanders, examined the vehicles for mechanical defects, and concluded that Sergeant Thompson had simply misjudged distance and timing when attempting his left turn. The fact that Thompson was following hand signals from another soldier who was directing traffic at the intersection complicated the question of responsibility, but did not change the basic finding that the truck had turned across the Cadillac's path without yielding right-of-way. The investigation noted that visibility was excellent, road conditions were dry and good, neither driver was speeding or impaired by alcohol or drugs, and both vehicles were mechanically sound with no evidence of brake or steering failure that might have contributed to the accident. What the investigation did not and could not address was the question of why Patton's injuries were so disproportionately severe compared to those of other passengers in the same vehicle. Because this disparity, while unusual, was attributed to the specific positioning of Patton's body at the moment of impact, rather than to any suspicious circumstances. Medical examinations of Patton immediately after the accident and autopsy examination after his death found injuries entirely consistent with the mechanism described by witnesses, with no evidence of any projectile wounds, stabbing injuries, or other trauma that would suggest deliberate violence rather than accidental injury. The conspiracy theories that have developed over the 80 years since Patton's death fall into several distinct categories based on who allegedly wanted him dead and what method was supposedly used. The most common theory suggests that American intelligence agencies or senior military commanders ordered Patton's assassination because his outspoken criticisms of Soviet policies and his advocacy for preventive war against the USSR made him politically dangerous at a time when American policy was shifting toward accommodation with the Soviets. This theory typically incorporates Bazata's 2008 confession as evidence and argues that the traffic accident was staged to provide cover for a covert killing. Though, as noted earlier, Bazata's claims have been thoroughly discredited by serious historians who have found no corroborating evidence and numerous internal contradictions in his various tellings of the story. The fundamental problem with this theory is that killing Patton was unnecessary, because he had already been effectively neutralized through his relief from command, and eliminating him would have created far more risk than simply allowing him to fade into retirement. A second category of conspiracy theory suggests that Soviet intelligence services killed Patton because he represented a threat to Soviet expansion in Europe and had advocated for military action against the USSR. This theory argues that Soviet agents either sabotaged Patton's vehicle or arranged the traffic accident to appear accidental, though again there is no documentary evidence from Soviet archives that have been extensively examined by historians since the end of the Cold War to support any such plot. A third category suggests that Patton's death resulted from action by vengeful former Nazis or German civilians who blamed him for harsh occupation policies or who viewed killing a prominent American general as an act of resistance against occupation. This theory has even less evidence supporting it than the others, because Patton was actually criticized for being too lenient toward former Nazis rather than too harsh, and there is no record of any German resistance organization targeting him or claiming responsibility after his death. What all of these conspiracy theories share is a fundamental unwillingness to accept that major historical figures can die from trivial causes, and a preference for dramatic narratives involving deliberate human agency over random accidents that carry no deeper meaning. The psychological appeal of conspiracy theories in general, and assassination theories in particular, has been extensively studied by social scientists who have found that people are especially drawn to conspiratorial explanations when confronting deaths that seem incongruous or unjust. And Patton's death clearly fits this pattern. The actual evidence from medical records, autopsy reports, witness testimony, and documentary records all supports the conclusion that Patton died exactly as contemporary accounts described, from complications of spinal cord injury sustained in a traffic accident caused by driver error. The lack of evidence for any alternative explanation, combined with the medical plausibility of the official account, makes conspiracy theories about Patton's death essentially impossible to sustain under serious scrutiny, though they will undoubtedly continue to circulate because they provide more satisfying narratives than simple accident. The ultimate significance of Patton's death lies not in the specific circumstances of how he died, but in the broader questions his final months raised about the relationship between military excellence and political judgment, and about whether qualities that make someone an outstanding combat commander necessarily translate into wisdom about grand strategy or foreign policy. Patton's battlefield genius is undeniable, and his tactical and operational skills rank among the finest displayed by any American commander in any war. But his political statements in his final months revealed a profound misunderstanding of the complexities of post-war international relations. Whether Patton's advocacy for preventive war against the Soviet Union in 1945 represented prescient recognition of the coming Cold War or dangerous warmongering that could have triggered World War III remains debatable among historians. Some argue that Patton correctly identified Soviet expansionism as a threat, and that his proposed solution, while politically impossible to implement, might have prevented decades of Cold War confrontation. while others contend that attempting military action against the USSR in 1945 would have been militarily catastrophic and morally indefensible. What remains clear is that Patton's death prevented him from having to navigate the complexities of the Cold War era, when his instinctive anti-communism might have made him either a valuable asset or a dangerous liability, depending on circumstances. His passage into history at the moment of his greatest fame ensured that his reputation would rest primarily on his unquestioned military achievements rather than on whatever his post-war career might have been. And this timing paradoxically enhanced his legendary status by preventing the kind of decline or controversy that marked the later years of some other wartime commanders. The enduring fascination with Patton's death reflects both his iconic status as a military figure and the persistent human desire to find patterns and meaning in events that may simply reflect the random operation of chance. The fact that serious historical investigation has found no credible evidence of assassination does not prevent people from speculating about alternative explanations, and the mystery and controversy surrounding his final days have become part of the Patton legend as much as his battlefield victories. 80 years after that December morning in 1945, when a routine traffic accident claimed one of America's most celebrated generals, the documented facts remain straightforward even as conspiracy theories continue to proliferate. General George S. Patton died from medical complications of spinal cord injury sustained when his staff car collided with an army truck on a German road. An accident that investigation found resulted from simple driver error rather than any suspicious circumstances. That this mundane explanation fails to satisfy people's desire for dramatic closure does not make it any less true, and serious students of history must distinguish between documented evidence and appealing speculation when examining even the most famous deaths. The annual December 21st anniversary of Patton's death brings renewed attention to both his remarkable military career and the circumstances of his passing, with ceremonies held at Ham American Cemetery and various military installations named in his honor continuing to commemorate his contributions to American military history. These observances typically focus on Patton's battlefield achievements and leadership qualities, rather than dwelling on conspiracy theories about his death, recognizing that his true legacy rests on documented military success rather than on unproven speculations about alleged plots. Modern military historians studying Patton's career have access to far more documentary evidence than was available in the immediate post-war period, including declassified intelligence files, personal correspondence, medical records, and extensive oral histories from veterans who served under his command. This wealth of evidence has enabled increasingly sophisticated analysis of both Patton's strengths and weaknesses as a commander, revealing a complex figure whose genuine military genius coexisted with significant character flaws and political naivety. The medical aspects of Patton's death have been thoroughly examined by physicians and forensic experts who have confirmed that his injuries and the complications that killed him were entirely consistent with the official account and reflect the tragic but understandable consequences of spinal cord trauma in an era before modern medical advances made such injuries more survivable. Nothing in the medical evidence suggests anything beyond the documented traffic accident, and attempts to find hidden evidence of foul play in autopsy reports or medical records have consistently failed because no such evidence exists. The enduring questions about Patton's death ultimately say more about human psychology and our collective difficulty accepting randomness and accident in the lives of major historical figures than they do about any actual historical mystery. Patton died the way millions of other people have died before and since, in a traffic accident that resulted from momentary human error and bad luck. That this prosaic explanation seems inadequate for such a towering figure reveals our need for grand narratives rather than any deficiency in the historical evidence. What remains beyond dispute is that Patton's death deprived America of one of its most talented battlefield commanders, at a moment when the transition from World War II to the Cold War was creating new challenges that might have benefited from his experience and insight. Though whether he would have proven capable of adapting to these new realities or would have continued making politically damaging statements remains unknowable. His legacy as one of America's greatest combat generals stands secure regardless of how he died, and the simple white cross marking his grave among thousands of identical markers serves as fitting memorial to a warrior who found his truest identity in leading soldiers rather than in the political maneuvering of peacetime.